The silence was the worst part of the siege, an unnatural quiet that had descended upon Station Erebos like a shroud. It was a silence manufactured by the enemy, the Consortium, a species that had made the cold equations of conquest into an art form. For 3 weeks, their obsidian, teardrop-shaped ships had hung in the void above the desolate moon of Xanthos, not with the fury of orbital bombardment, but with the patient, suffocating pressure of a predator waiting for its prey to exhaust itself. The war, a decade-long blaze across a dozen sectors, had finally reached this forgotten corner of human space, a research outpost that had been studying the primitive silicon-based life forms slumbering deep beneath the moon's crust. Now, it was a tomb in waiting. Commander Eva Rostova felt the silence in her bones, a low, persistent thrum that vibrated just at the edge of hearing. It was the frequency, the weapon the Consortium had used to shatter the morale of 6 other starfaring species before they'd even met humanity. A sonic resonator that didn't just disrupt communications, but seemed to target the very synapses of hope itself, replacing resolve with a creeping, logical despair. It whispered a simple, irrefutable truth into the minds of her soldiers: you are surrounded. You are outnumbered. Your defeat is a mathematical certainty. Surrender is the only logical outcome. Rostova stood on the command deck, a cramped space of flickering holo displays and the metallic tang of recycled air, and watched the faces of her remaining crew. They were ghosts, their eyes hollow, their movements sluggish, as if wading through molasses. They did their duties with the grim automaton precision of the condemned, but the fire was gone. She saw it in the tremor of a technician's hand, the vacant stare of a Marine who had held the line against Consortium drones for 72 straight hours. The resonator was winning. Her own defenses were purely mental, a lifetime of military discipline forming a bulwark against the tide of hopelessness. But even her walls were cracking. The logic was so seductive, so simple. The Consortium didn't need to break their bodies when they could so efficiently unmake their minds. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Thorne, approached, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Ma'am, Perimeter 4 just went dark. The drones have breached the outer airlock. Engineering reports power fluctuations across the lower decks. We have maybe 3 hours before they're at the command level." Rostova didn't turn from the main viewport, which showed nothing but the patient, silent ships of the enemy. "And the Scythe Protocol?" she asked, her voice flat. Thorne swallowed hard. "Armed and ready on your command. Full data wipe and reactor overload. It will be quick. Quick. A clean, logical end. They would deny the Consortium their prize, the complete bioscan and societal data of the dormant Xanthians, a species that had never even seen the stars. Humanity had a rule, a line drawn in the sand. After witnessing the Consortium's methods, they would not allow another species to be indexed and either assimilated or erased based on the Consortium's cold calculus of utility. That data was the only reason the enemy was here, the only reason Erebos hadn't been vaporized from orbit on day 1. They wanted to understand, to compute, to add another variable to their grand equation of the universe. In the corner of the command deck, hunched over a makeshift analysis station cobbled together from scavenged monitors and diagnostic tools, a figure was oblivious to the encroaching doom. Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to the lieutenant, was a civilian contractor, a xenolinguist who'd been caught on Erebos when the invasion began. Conscripted by battlefield necessity, she was now their de facto intelligence officer, tasked with the impossible finding a pattern, a weakness, in an enemy that communicated in pure data streams and acted with the flawless logic of a distributed consciousness. She was a woman who looked as if she were held together by caffeine and sheer intellectual stubbornness. Her dark hair tied in a messy knot, her eyes, magnified by cheap reader glasses, darting across cascades of meaningless code. For weeks she had listened to the enemy's silence, to the pervasive hum of the resonator, trying to find a language where there was none. Rostova had dismissed her work as a fool's errand, a desperate attempt to find meaning in the void, but she had let it continue. It was better than letting the doctor succumb to the despair like everyone else. Eris muttered to herself, her fingers flying across a holographic keyboard. No, that's not it. It's a feedback loop, but it's self-correcting. Every time we try to jam it, it analyzes the counterfrequency and adjusts. It learns. It's not just a broadcast. It's a conversation. A very one-sided conversation. The station shuddered, a deep groan of tortured metal that sent a shower of sparks down from a ceiling conduit. A red alert klaxon blared, a jarring, physical sound in the oppressive quiet. "They're through the sub-level," Lieutenant Thorne shouted over the noise. "They're using plasma cutters on the blast doors to Section Gamma." Rostova's face was grim stone. This was it. The final act. "Initiate the Scythe Protocol," she commanded, her voice betraying no emotion. "Authorization code, Rostova 9 Echo Tango." The lieutenant nodded, his expression a mixture of terror and relief, and moved to the command console. The end had come. But as he reached for the activation panel, Eris shot up from her seat, her chair clattering against the deck. "Wait!" she yelled, her voice raw and cracking. She stumbled toward the command platform, holding up a data slate that glowed with complex waveforms. "Commander, don't do it. Please, just give me 5 minutes." Rostova turned, her gaze withering. "Doctor, in 5 minutes, consortium drones will be standing where you are now. There is nothing left to do. We will not allow that data to fall into their hands. I know I don't care about the data. I care about the broadcast," Eris insisted, shoving the slate into Rostova's field of vision. "Look, this is the resonator's waveform. It's perfect, isn't it? It's a pure, logical sine wave, designed for maximum psychic resonance. It's designed to convince the target of inevitable defeat. But that's its weakness." Lieutenant Thorne paused, his hand hovering over the console. "Weakness, it's torn us apart without firing a single shot." "Exactly." Eris's eyes were wild, alight with a terrifying ways, manic energy that hadn't been seen on Erebos for weeks. "It's a logic bomb for the soul. It works because it's irrefutable. It presents a conclusion surrender and provides the evidence. But what happens when you present it with something that has no logic? Something that doesn't compute?" Rostova stared at the xenolinguist as if she'd lost her mind. The hum of the resonator seemed to deepen, whispering its sweet, nihilistic poison into her thoughts. "It's over. This is madness. A logical end is preferable to a chaotic one." "What are you talking about, Doctor?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. Eris took a deep breath, her entire body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She looked from the commander to the tactical display showing the steady, relentless advance of the consortium drones. She knew how insane it was going to sound, so she knew it was the longest of long shots. A plan born not of strategy, but of a sudden, desperate epiphany about the nature of her own species. "Their greatest strength is their perfect logic," Eris said, her voice growing stronger, more certain. "They assimilated the data of every species they conquered, and they learned that all organic life eventually breaks. When faced with inevitable doom, it chooses the path of least pain. It surrenders. It's a universal constant for them. But they've never met us. Not really. They don't understand that when a human is backed into a corner with no logical way out, they don't always choose surrender. She pointed a trembling finger at the station's main comms array controls. They're having a one-way conversation. I want to talk back. I want to use the main comms dish, bypass the governors, and broadcast something directly into their network on the same frequency as their resonator. Lieutenant Thorne scoffed. Broadcast what the technical specs of our coffee maker, we have nothing that can hurt them. Not hurt them, Eris corrected, a strange, fierce smile touching her lips. Confuse them, frighten them. I want to broadcast something utterly, profoundly illogical, something their collective consciousness cannot process, something so alien to their way of thinking that it will force them to pause. The station rocked again, more violently this time. A new alarm began to shriek, signaling a hull breach on the lower levels. Rostova's face was a study in conflict. Her training, her experience, every fiber of her being screamed at her to follow protocol, to grant her crew a clean death and protect the Xanthian data. But in the doctor's frantic eyes, she saw the first spark of genuine, irrational defiance she'd seen in weeks. It was a stark contrast to the soul-crushing logic of the resonator. It felt human. What? Rostova finally whispered, the word barely audible over the alarms. What do you want to broadcast? Eris Thorne looked at the grim-faced commander, the terrified lieutenant, and the hollowed-out crew of the dying station. Her idea was absurd. It was a shot in the deepest dark, an insult to military strategy and common sense. It was the only thing she had left. Commander, she said, her voice steady now, filled with an insane, brilliant conviction that cut through the psychic gloom. I have an idea. Eris Thorne's idea, when it came, was not a complex tactical maneuver or a newly discovered exploit in consortium code. It was something far more fragile and, to Commander Rostova's mind, infinitely more insane. I want to broadcast a story, Eris said, her voice barely a whisper in the cacophony of alarms. Specifically, a children's bedtime story. One about a rabbit who is too clever for a fox. Rostova stared, her face an unreadable mask of granite. The logic of the resonator seemed to press in on her, mocking the absurdity of the suggestion. This is the panic before the end, the mind breaking. Initiate the protocol. It is the only sane option. Doctor, she began, her voice dangerously calm. You are relieved of duty. Lieutenant, escort Dr. Thorne to the medbay and carry out my last order. Lieutenant Thorne, however, didn't move. He was looking at Eris, not with contempt, but with a dawning, bewildered curiosity. The resonator's grip on his own mind seemed to have slipped, just for a moment. In the face of this utter non sequitur, a bedtime story, it was so profoundly stupid, so disconnected from their reality of plasma cutters and imminent death, that it created a pocket of cognitive dissonance the resonator couldn't immediately fill. No, listen to me, Eris pleaded, her gaze locked on Rostova. Their weapon works by creating a closed logical loop. Premise: we are an overwhelming force. Premise: you are trapped and outnumbered. Conclusion: your struggle is futile. Surrender is the only logical path to minimize suffering. They are feeding us an equation that only has one answer. We have to give them a variable they have no context for. It's something that isn't defiance in a way they can measure, like a final charge or a patriotic speech. They would just categorize that as predictable last stand behavior. We need to show them a mind that, in the face of certain annihilation, chooses to engage in an act of pointless, gentle creativity. It's a paradox. It's a bug in their philosophy. The station groaned again, a long, mournful sound of dying metal. On the tactical display, the red icons representing the consortium drones were no longer just at the door to Section Gamma. They were through it. They were advancing down the primary access corridor, 10 minutes, maybe less, before they were at the command deck's final blast door. "It's a fairy tale, Doctor," Rostova countered, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The spark of defiance Eris had lit was warring with a lifetime of military pragmatism. "It's a child's fantasy." "Yes," Eris exclaimed, her face lighting up. "And what is more illogical than fantasy? What is more antithetical to their entire existence than make-believe they index species? They quantify civilizations. They reduce everything to usable data. We're about to broadcast pure, unquantifiable noise. It won't be a weapon. It will be a question. What kind of species, when facing its own erasure, tells itself stories about a clever rabbit? They will have to stop and compute. Their entire distributed consciousness will have to divert resources to solve this impossible riddle. It might only buy us a few minutes, but it's more than we have now." Rostova looked at the faces of her crew. The ones who were still functional were watching the exchange, their expressions a mixture of confusion and a desperate, fledgling hope that was terrifying to behold. Hope was a dangerous thing on Station Erebos, but despair was a certainty. She had been trained to calculate risks, to weigh outcomes. On one hand was the Scythe Protocol, certain death. Mission accomplished. On the other was a mad woman's plan to weaponize a bedtime story, almost certain death. Mission failure, and the potential for a very embarrassing and inexplicable final log entry. But Eris was right about one thing. The consortium expected them to fight, or to die, or to surrender. They did not expect a nursery rhyme. In that gap of expectation, in that sliver of pure, unadulterated human weirdness, lay the only path that wasn't already paved by the enemy. With an almost imperceptible nod, Rostova made her decision. "Get her on the air," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise with renewed authority. "Divert all remaining power to the main comms dish. I want maximum broadcast strength, wide band, aimed directly at the lead consortium vessel. Bypass all safety protocols and governors. I want her voice to be the only thing they hear in this system." The effect on the crew was instantaneous. The automaton-like despair shattered, replaced by a frantic, purposeful energy. Comms technician Reisner, a man who hadn't spoken more than 2 words at a time in a week, began working his console with a feverish intensity, his fingers flying across the controls as he rerouted power conduits and disabled limiters. "Main dish is offline for deep space listening. Commander," he shouted, his voice hoarse, "bringing it online for active broadcast. Will take 90 seconds and will fry half the relays on this deck. Then you have 89 seconds. Rostova replied without blinking. Lieutenant Thorne was already at Eris's side, patching her personal comm unit directly into the main broadcast board. "The resonator will interfere," he said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to create a clean signal." "Use it," Eris told him, her voice suddenly calm, her earlier manic energy replaced by a focused serenity. "Don't fight their frequency. Ride it. Modulate my voice onto their own carrier wave. Let's make it seem like the thought is originating inside their own network. Let's tell them a bedtime story from the inside out." The idea was so audacious that Thorn could only stare for a second before a grim smile touched his lips. He nodded and began to work, his movements now precise and efficient. While they worked, Rostova strode over to the station's armory locker, punched in her command codes, and pulled out a standard-issue MR7 pulse rifle. She checked the charge pack, slapped it into place, and took up a position facing the main blast door, her back to the frantic activity of her crew. She was a commander, and her final duty was to hold the line. She would buy her insane civilian the time she needed. 70 seconds to broadcast, Reisner called out. A heavy thud echoed through the deck as something massive impacted the blast door, followed by the high-pitched whine of a plasma cutter beginning to trace a molten line across its surface. The drones were here. "Dr. Thorn," Rostova said, her eyes never leaving the glowing orange seam appearing on the door. "You're on." Lieutenant Thorn gave Eris a thumbs up. "You're live in 5, 4, 3. Eris closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly. She ignored the screech of the plasma cutter, the shuddering of the deck, the shouts of the technicians. She pushed aside the cold tendrils of the resonator that were still trying to find purchase in her mind, whispering of futility and ash. Instead, she thought of her nephew, back on Earth, tucked into his bed, his small face looking up at her with trusting eyes. She found that memory, held it close, and began to speak, her voice soft, clear, and utterly calm. It was a voice that held no place in a war zone. It was the voice of a lullaby. "Once upon a time," she began, her words now piggybacking on the consortium's own psychic weapon, flowing out from Station Erebos and into the cold, silent minds of the enemy ships. In a green meadow filled with sunshine and clover, there lived a small rabbit named Pip. Another thud rocked the blast door. The molten seam was halfway complete. Rostova raised her rifle, sighting down the barrel. She could hear Eris's voice, not just from the comms link, but as a faint, melodic echo in her own mind, a gentle counter-frequency to the oppressive hum. Now, Pip was not the biggest rabbit, or the strongest, Eris continued, her rhythm steady and soothing. But he was very, very clever. And in the dark woods at the edge of the meadow, there lived a great, hungry fox who wanted nothing more than to eat Pip for his dinner. On the command displays, something impossible was happening. Reisner was the first to see it, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Commander, the resonator signal. It's fluctuating." Rostova risked a glance. The perfect, elegant sine wave that had tormented them for weeks was stuttering. It was wavering, losing its perfect symmetry, as if the entity broadcasting it was confused. On the tactical map, the red icons of the drones in the corridor had stopped their advance. They were still there, just outside the door, but their relentless forward momentum had ceased. "Every day," Eris's voice flowed on, a gentle river in the silence of space. "The fox would lay a trap for Pip. One day, he dug a deep hole and covered it with leaves. But Pip, seeing that one patch of leaves was not kissed by the morning dew like the others, simply hopped around it. And the plasma cutter outside the door sputtered and died. The high-pitched whine was gone. In its place was an unnerving silence, broken only by Eris's storytelling and the hum of the station's failing life support. Every single person on the command deck had stopped what they were doing and was now staring at the tactical display. The drone icons remained motionless. The wavering resonator signal became more erratic, spiking and dipping like a frantic heartbeat. The consortium, a civilization-killing entity of pure, cold logic, was trying to understand about a rabbit and a fox. They were trying to parse the tactical significance of morning dew on a leaf. They were being fed a data set that was not only useless, but fundamentally nonsensical, and it was causing the entire system to hesitate. So the next day, Eris said, as a small, less knowing smile in her voice, the fox tried a different trick. He found a hollow log and waited inside, thinking Pip would run through it to escape a passing hawk. But Pip, who knew the heart of every log in his meadow, saw that this one had no friendly spiders spinning webs at its entrance, and so he hopped a different way home. High above them, in the obsidian ships that had been the arbiters of their doom, a consciousness spanning thousands of vessels was grinding to a halt. The logic was inescapable. The entity on the station was facing imminent destruction. The entity should be transmitting distress signals, tactical data, defiance, or silence. Instead, it was transmitting this narrative, this illogical parable of predator and prey, where the weaker, smaller entity prevailed through esoteric observation. It did not compute. What was the tactical purpose of friendly spiders? What was the strategic value of a different way home? The data was corrupting. It was an anomaly that threatened the integrity of their predictive models. For the first time in 10,000 years of conquest, the consortium did not know what to do next. On the command deck of Station Erebos, Commander Rostova slowly lowered her rifle, a single, impossible thought cutting through the fog of war. It might actually be working. The silence that followed was 1,000 times heavier than the alarms it had replaced. Outside the command deck's blast door, the consortium drones were inert, their plasma cutters extinguished, their relentless advance halted by a fable. Inside, the crew of Station Erebos stood like statues, every eye fixed on the tactical display where the red icons remained frozen in the corridor. For a full minute, the only sound was the strained hum of the life support system and the faint, almost imperceptible echo of Eris Thorne's last words hanging in the air. And so he hopped a different way home. It was Commander Rostova who broke the spell. Her pulse rifle was still held at a low ready, but her gaze had shifted from the door to Eris, who stood pale and trembling by the comm station, the data slate clutched in her hand like a holy text. The commander's mind, trained for decades in the brutal logic of war, was struggling to process the tactical reality of what had just happened. They had faced a fleet that had shattered star systems, and they had stopped it with a nursery rhyme. Reisner. Rostova's voice was a low rasp, cutting through the quiet. Status report on the consortium fleet. The comms technician, who looked as though he'd just witnessed a miracle, shook himself from his stupor. Commander, their ships are holding position. No change in energy signatures. No weapons charging. But the resonator broadcast, it's changed. He brought the waveform up on the main screen. The angry, erratic scribbles of a confused system had smoothed out. The perfect, soul-crushing sine wave was gone. In its place was a complex, multi-layered signal that pulsed with a slow, inquisitive rhythm. It was no longer a weapon hammering at their minds. It was a scanner, listening with an intensity that felt more invasive than any psychic attack. "It's them," Eris whispered, her eyes wide as she stared at the screen. She swayed slightly, and Lieutenant Thorne put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "They're not confused anymore. They're analyzing. They're trying to understand the story." As if on cue, a new sensation prickled at the edge of Eris's consciousness. It wasn't the crushing despair of the resonator, but something else, something colder and more precise. It was a series of silent, data-rich queries being beamed directly into her mind, piggybacking on the same carrier wave she had used. They weren't words, but concepts, raw data packets that her brain struggled to interpret. She saw flashes of complex geometric shapes dissolving into the chemical structure of cellulose. She felt the mathematical equation for velocity and trajectory overlaid with the biological imperative of a predator. They were deconstructing her words, trying to file them into their vast index of the universe. Query, the feeling in her head communicated. Define clever. Specify parameters. Differentiate from cunning and intelligent. Provide quantifiable examples. Then another query. Colder still. Input, fox. Cross-reference with terrestrial vulpine species. Query is the hunger attribute a literal metabolic requirement or a metaphorical representation of territorial ambition. They were trying to turn her story into an algorithm. "They're talking to me," Eris said, pressing her fingertips to her temples. "They want me to explain, to define the terms." Rostova was at her side in an instant. "Can you block it?" "I don't think I should," Eris replied, her breathing shallow. "If I go silent now, they'll classify the story as a random, anomalous data burst and resume the attack. I have to keep the channel open. I have to keep them interested." Rostova's expression was grim. They had won a reprieve, but they had walked into a different kind of trap. Eris had become a bridge, a direct line into the mind of an entity that had only ever known how to dissect and conquer. "What do you need?" the commander asked, her voice shifting from shock to a hard, protective pragmatism. "Power. I need the comms channel stable," Eris answered, "and I need to keep telling the story." She took a shaky breath, leaned back toward the microphone, and closed her eyes, delving back into the strange, mental dialogue with the consortium. "The fox," she began, her voice a little unsteady at first, "was very cunning. He knew all about traps and holes and ambushes." As she spoke, she focused her intent, shaping her thoughts into a response to their silent query. She didn't send them data, she sent them feelings, images. She projected the scent of pine needles in the dark woods, the glint of moonlight in the fox's hungry eyes, the taste of fear in the air. Response, she thought, shaping the narrative. Cleverness is not a state, it is an action. It is the application of knowledge in a novel way to subvert an expected outcome. It is a form of benign chaos. The waveform on the main screen pulsed in response. The silent queries in her head paused, as if the entire consortium consciousness was processing this new, infuriatingly abstract definition. Then, a new query, more fundamental than the others. Query, define chaos, differentiate from entropy. But Pip the Rabbit was clever in a different way. Eris continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. He didn't think about traps. He thought about sunshine. He thought about the taste of sweet carrots and the feeling of soft grass under his paws. His cleverness wasn't about defeating the fox. It was about living his life so fully and so joyfully that the fox's plans simply didn't matter. It was a complete fabrication, a piece of the story she had invented on the spot. But it felt right. She was feeding them the core of human irrationality, the ability to find purpose and meaning in things other than survival. She was telling a race of pure logicians that the ultimate strategy was to ignore the equation entirely. For several long moments, there was no response. The pulsing signal from the fleet held steady, and the drones outside the door remained silent. Then, on the deck plating in front of the blast door, a low grinding sound began. A tiny, filament-thin probe, no thicker than a wire, was emerging from the molten seam the plasma cutter had made. It moved like an insect, its multi-jointed legs clicking softly as it advanced into the room. A tiny, multifaceted lens at its tip, glowing with a soft blue light. "Contact!" Lieutenant Thorne yelled, raising his sidearm. Rostova stepped in front of him, her own rifle aimed at the probe, but she didn't fire. "Hold," she commanded, her voice tight. "It's not a weapon. It's a sensor. They want a physical sample. They need to correlate the biological data of the storyteller with the narrative itself." The tiny probe stopped a few meters from the door, its lens swiveling to focus directly on Eris. The silent queries in her mind sharpened, becoming more specific, correlating audio signal with biological source, requesting atmospheric sample, requesting cellular data. They wanted to dissect her, to understand the flesh that could produce such madness. "Commander," Thorne said, his voice low and urgent, "that thing is a breach of this deck. My orders are to eliminate any unauthorized incursion." "Your orders," Rostova countered, her eyes never leaving the probe, "are to follow my command, and right now." "Doctor, Thorne is the single most valuable military asset in this sector. That probe is their attempt to understand her. As long as they are trying to understand, they aren't shooting. So we let them look." The decision went against every rule in the book, against every instinct Rostova had. But she was no longer in the book. She was in a place of mad logic and weaponized fables. Eris, for her part, seemed to barely notice the probe. Her focus was entirely inward, locked in her silent conversation with the fleet. She was leading them deeper into the illogical forest of her story, introducing new, impossible concepts with every sentence. She told them of how Pip once escaped the fox not by running, but by teaching a grumpy badger how to laugh. A sound so strange and unexpected it startled the fox into dropping his net. Query. The consortium pulsed back. Define laughter. Is it a threat vocalization? A biological spasm provide acoustic data and correlation with emotional state. Eris fed them the feeling of it, the warmth in the chest, the lightness, the shared joy that has no purpose beyond itself. She was giving them the human soul, one piece at a time, and they were choking on it. It was then that Rostova's new plan began to form. It was a desperate gamble, an escalation of Eris's own mad strategy. The xenolinguist had opened a door into the mind of the consortium. It was a fragile, temporary opening, but it was there. And if you have a door, you can do more than just talk through it. Rostova turned to Reisner. "Technician, can you isolate the exact frequency Dr. Thorne is using to modulate her voice onto their carrier wave?" "Yes, ma'am," Reisner said, his fingers already dancing on his console. "It's a complex overlay, but I can piggyback a data stream onto it. It would have to be small, heavily compressed." "Do it," Rostova ordered. She then looked at Lieutenant Thorne. "Get me a line to engineering. I want Dr. Mkenji. Tell him I need a virus. Not a crude explosive code, but a logic bomb. Something elegant and vicious. I need a question that a purely logical consciousness cannot answer without entering a self-referential, infinite loop. Something that will crash their entire distributed network." Thorne's eyes widened as he understood the sheer yet beautiful audacity of the plan. They weren't just going to confuse the enemy. They were going to use a children's story as a delivery system for a weapon that could end the entire siege or even turn the tide of the war. They were going to poison the well. "Commander," Thorne said with a slow, grim smile, Kenji's been working on something like that as a theoretical exercise for years. He calls it the liar's paradox. He's going to love this. While Thorn relayed the orders, the probe on the floor began to move again, inching closer to the comms station. Eris was deep in her trance, her voice a soft, hypnotic murmur as she spun her tail. She was now telling the consortium about the concept of a promise, an illogical commitment to a future action that defied all variables. The consortium was struggling with it, sending frantic pulses of data as it tried to fit the concept of trust into its predictive models. The probe was 10 feet from her now. 5. It extended a delicate, needle-like appendage. Rostova kept her rifle steady, her finger resting on the trigger. Everything depended on keeping Eris safe, on keeping the channel open just long enough. The fate of her crew, her stations, and perhaps a great deal more, now rested on the story of a clever rabbit and the philosophical poison they were about to hide within its final chapter. The command deck of Station Erebos had become a strange sort of theater. In the center, Eris Thorn, the unwilling storyteller, her eyes closed as if in a trance, her voice the only human sound in the oppressive silence. Her audience was twofold: the exhausted, terrified crew hanging on her every word, and an alien consciousness of immense power that was, for the moment, utterly captivated. Hovering just a few feet away was the consortium's probe, a sliver of black metal and blue light, its multifaceted lens focused on her with an unnerving intensity. It was a critic, a scientist, and a predator, all rolled into one. Rostova stood between Eris and the probe, her pulse rifle held in a low, non-threatening grip. She had become a guardian of the narrative, a sentinel posted at the border of logic and madness. Her gamble was in motion. Down in the bowels of the station, Dr. Kenji was forging their weapon, and every word Eris spoke was buying him another precious second. Eris, feeling the consortium's cold, analytical attention, knew she couldn't simply repeat the same themes. She had to take them deeper, into territory so fundamentally alien to their processing that it would require their full, undivided attention. She had to give them the illogical, and now she would give them the impossible. But one day, she began, her voice taking on a somber, gentle tone. The fox's trap was not meant for Pip. He saw his friend, a tiny field mouse named Squeak, caught in a wire snare, hidden in the tall grass. The fox was watching from the woods, waiting. He knew Pip would come for his friend. The silent queries that flooded Eris's mind were sharper now, more insistent than before. The concept of friendship had already been a difficult data set for Yetsun, classified as a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship for enhanced survival probability. But this was different. Query. The consortium pulsed, the thought a cascade of cold equations. The optimal strategy is self-preservation. The Pip entity is not constrained. The Squeak entity is of lower biomass and negligible strategic value. Logical course of action is abandonment. Why would the narrative suggest an alternate outcome? Pip knew it was a trap. Eris continued, her voice weaving a spell to hold the Leviathan's attention. He knew the fox was bigger, and faster, and stronger. To go into the tall grass meant he would surely be caught. His life would be over. Logical thing to do, the smart thing to do, was to run away and save himself. She was laying out their own argument for them, presenting their cold calculus as the only reasonable path. She could feel their consensus, a silent, system-wide nod of agreement. Affirmative. The PIP entity's survival probability drops to near zero if it attempts intervention. The narrative must conclude with its retreat. It was then that Eris deployed her own logic bomb, the one made of human feeling. But Pip did not run, she said softly, because the warmth he felt when he shared a carrot with Squeak was more important than all the carrots in the world. The sound of his friend's laughter was a greater prize than another day of sunshine. And so, he took a deep breath, and he stepped into the tall grass, toward the trap. The reaction was instantaneous. The complex waveform on the main screen dissolved into a chaotic, shrieking line of pure static. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, seeming to emanate from the very hull of the station. The tiny probe on the deck twitched, its blue light flashing a furious, angry red. In Eris's mind, the queries became a storm of frantic, contradictory data. Paradox altruism as a terminal strategy is a flaw in the code of life. The value of an emotional memory cannot override the primary survival directive. Data is corrupt. Data is illogical. Requesting clarification, re-fucking questing clarification. The last part was not a query, but a jumble of raw emotion, a bleed-over of pure, unadulterated frustration from the alien consciousness. They were not just confused, they were offended. This story violated the fundamental laws of their universe. Lieutenant Thorne, his face pale, rushed to Rostova's side. "Commander, I have Kenji. He says the core of the liar's paradox is coded. He needs to wrap it in a compression algorithm and hide it inside a data packet. He needs at least 5 more minutes." Rostova's eyes were locked on the probe, which was now moving forward with a new, menacing purpose. Its filament legs clicked sharply on the deck plating. "He has 3, she said, her voice a low growl. "Tell him to work faster." The probe was no longer just observing. It was advancing on Eris. Its needle-like appendage extended. The consortium, unable to process the concept of self-sacrifice, had defaulted to a more direct method of data acquisition. If the storyteller's mind was the source of the paradox, they would analyze the source directly. Rostova stepped forward, planting her feet firmly between the probe and Eris. "That's far enough," she said, her voice calm and cold, as if speaking to a disobedient dog. The probe paused, its red light bathing her face. It tilted its lens, scanning her from head to toe. A new query, this one directed at Rostova through Eris, pierced the mental chaos. "Identify this unit. Function Guardian. A secondary entity is sacrificing its tactical advantage to protect the primary source of the illogical data. This reinforces the paradox. Explain. Immediately." "Keep talking. Aris," Rostova ordered, never taking her eyes off the probe. "Don't let them think. Tell them what happens next." Eris, trembling from the psychic backlash, swallowed hard and found her voice. "Pip! Pip ran to his friend." He began to chew at the wire snare, his small teeth working frantically. He knew the fox was coming. He could hear the rustle of leaves, but he did not stop. 2 minutes, Thorne whispered, his voice strained. "Kenji is compiling the virus now. He says the wrapper is a data packet defining the acoustic and emotional properties of laughter. He's hiding the paradox inside the punchline." It was a plan of such breathtaking absurdity that for a moment, Rostova almost smiled. The probe moved again, trying to circle around her. Rostova shifted her position, mirroring its movement, keeping her body between it and Eris. It was a strange, silent dance on the edge of oblivion. The probe stopped, its appendage twitching. Then, with a speed that was terrifying, it lunged, not at Rostova's body, but at her rifle. The needle-like tip shot out and struck the weapon's power pack. There was a bright flash, a shower of sparks, and the pulse rifle went dead in Rostova's hands. She didn't hesitate. Dropping the useless weapon, she lunged forward, not to strike the probe, but to catch it. Her gloved hands closed around its small, metallic body. A jolt of electricity shot up her arms, making her teeth rattle, but she held on. The probe struggled in her grip, its legs scrabbling against her suit, its red light flashing directly into her eyes. She could feel the vibrations of its internal mechanisms, the thrum of its alien power. She was in physical contact with the enemy, a direct, tactile interface. Through the contact, through Eris's mental bridge, she felt a raw, focused blast of the consortium's consciousness. Release the data drone. Your interference is illogical. The story. Aris. Rostova grunted, her muscles straining as she wrestled with the surprisingly strong machine. Finish it. Eris's eyes snapped open. She saw her commander, unarmed, physically fighting the alien machine to protect her. She saw the definition of sacrifice, no longer a fairy tale, but a living, breathing reality in front of her. The wire snapped. Eris almost shouted into the mic. Squeak was free, and as the fox leaped from the trees, Pip did not run. He stood his ground, looked the great fox in the eye, and he laughed. Thorn was at her elbow, his face alight with a terrifying glee. It's done. The virus is uploaded to the broadcast buffer. It's packaged inside the laughter data. It's ready. Commander. Rostova was on one knee, her arms locked, the probe still thrashing in her grip. The red light from its lens was so bright, it felt like it was boring into her skull. She could feel its power building, preparing for a much stronger electrical discharge, one that could kill her. This was the moment, the culmination of the madness. They had held the line. They had baited the trap. With the full, undivided attention of the entire consortium fleet focused on this single, this impossible moment in a children's story. She gave her final order. Every ounce of defiance, every bit of human irrationality was packed into 2 words. Send it. The moment Thorn hit the broadcast command, the universe held its breath. For Eris, it was not a sound but a sensation, a psychic detonation that erupted from the bridge of her mind. The laughter she had broadcast, a concept packaged with Kenji's elegant, poisonous code, struck the consortium's collective consciousness, not as data, but as a violation. She felt their unified mind try, for a single microsecond, to process the impossible. They tried to solve the liar's paradox, the statement that is true if it is false, and false if it is true, that was now nested within the very definition of joy. It was a question a logical mind could not answer, a command that could not be obeyed, a piece of code that could only be resolved by entering an infinite, self-consuming loop. She felt a shriek of pure, unsolvable paradox rip through the silent network that connected 1,000 warships. It was the sound of a god discovering its own mortality. The probe in Rostova's hands convulsed, a final, violent spasm that almost tore it from her grip. The angry red light in its lens flickered, then shifted to a brilliant, cleansing white, as if its core programming was being incinerated. Then, with a faint electronic sigh, it went dark. The thrashing, alien thing that had fought with such terrifying strength became mere dead weight, its filament legs curling inward like a dying insect. Rostova let it clatter to the deck, her arms screaming in protest, every muscle aching from the strain and the electrical feedback. On the main screen, the effect was apocalyptic. The complex inquisitive waveform of the consortium fleet vanished, replaced by a flat deadline, ship by ship. The energy signatures that had surrounded them like a cage of stars began to flicker out. One moment, they were a fleet of unimaginable power. The next, they were a ghost armada, a graveyard of dark, silent shapes hanging in the void. The oppressive, soul-crushing hum of the resonator, a pressure they had lived with for so long they had almost forgotten what true silence felt like, was gone. The quiet that descended upon the command deck was not the weaponized silence of the enemy, but a vast, blessed, empty silence of victory. For a long moment, the only sound was Rostova's ragged breathing. Then, from Reisner's console, a single, choked sob broke the stillness. Lieutenant Thorne stared at the tactical display, his mouth agape. "They're gone," he whispered, the words filled with a disbelief so profound it was almost painful. "Their power signatures are 0. The drones in the corridor, they're inactive. Ma'am, I think we won." The tension on the bridge did not break in a cheer, but in a slow, collective exhale, the sound of 100 souls letting go of a weight they thought they would carry to their graves. And at the comm station, Eris Thorne, the woman who had weaponized a fairy tale, crumpled to the floor in a dead faint, the psychic backlash of a dying god finally overwhelming her. An hour later, a fragile sense of normalcy had begun to return to Station Erebos. The blast door to the command deck was still scarred with a molten seam, and the dead consortium probe lay on a medical tray like a dissected specimen. But the air was different. It tasted of hope. Rostova found Eris in the small observation lounge, a cup of nutrient paste held untouched in her hands, a thermal blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was staring out the viewport at the dead fleet, which hung in the starlight like a memorial to its own arrogance. "Their minds," Eris said, her voice quiet and hoarse, not looking at Rostova. It wasn't like a switch being flipped. It was like watching a library burn, a million billion thoughts, all perfectly ordered, suddenly twisting into nonsense. They were so certain of the universe, of the rules. Our story. It didn't just break a rule. It proved the rules didn't exist. Rostova stood beside her, following her gaze into the star-dusted darkness. She had already sent her preliminary report to High Command, a report so outlandish she knew it would be met with either a court-martial or a medal of the highest honor. She had detailed how the consortium's greatest weapon, their perfect logic, was also their most catastrophic vulnerability. "You saved us, Doctor," Rostova said, the words feeling inadequate for the scale of what had happened. "That story about Pip the Rabbit, it will probably become a legend." Eris gave a weak, tired smile. "It wasn't about the rabbit, was it? It was about the fox." They saw themselves as the fox, the inevitable, logical predator. They couldn't comprehend a universe where the rabbit would choose to lose everything for a friend. It wasn't a strategy they could compute. She finally turned to look at the commander, her eyes clear and filled with a deep, weary understanding. "You understood that, didn't you, when you stood between me and that probe? You became part of the story." Rostova considered this. She was a soldier, a creature of strategy and protocol. But in that moment, facing the probe, none of that had mattered. She had acted on something older, something more fundamental, an illogical, human instinct to protect. "The war isn't over," Rostova said, her voice low. "They have other fleets, other sectors. But now Now we know how to fight them. We have a weapon they can never understand. Eris looked back at the silent, drifting hulks. They were more than just defeated enemies now. They were a testament to a new truth in the galaxy. The laughter of a rabbit had become the kill code for a god. The story of a small act of selfless courage had toppled an empire built on the certainty of self-preservation. High above the forgotten moon of Xanthos, the great, hungry fox was no longer watching the meadow. A new variable had been introduced into the grand equation of the universe, an unpredictable, chaotic, and ridiculously stubborn variable that valued a friend over survival, a promise over logic, and a good story over all the quantifiable data in the stars. The universe was now a little less certain, a little more chaotic, and, Rostova suspected, a great deal more human.